She once ran through gunfire to pull wounded soldiers to safety. She lost her leg doing it. But when she came home, she was met with silence. Charlotte Evans didn't fall on the battlefield. She fell in the cold stares of the very people she had protected. One scorching afternoon in Tucson, a group of construction workers mocked her limp and her prosthetic leg. No one stood up for her. No one said a word. But when a black SUV pulled up and 7 men in black stepped out, the entire job site froze, because they realized they had just picked the wrong person to laugh at. What happened next didn't just silence the mockery, it started a national conversation. The real question isn't what did she do, but rather, how long have we ignored the people who gave us everything? Charlotte Evans wasn't the kind of woman you noticed in a crowd. Mid-40s, quiet, sun-worn skin, and a limp that matched her steady silence. She lived alone in a weathered apartment complex tucked behind a tire shop in the outskirts of Tucson, Arizona, a place where the days were blistering and the nights hummed with desert wind. Each Tuesday, like clockwork, she boarded bus 27 with a worn olive duffel over her shoulder. Inside it, her medications, a notebook filled with scribbled reminders, and a marine cap creased, sun-faded, and never worn, but never left behind. That cap had seen smoke, sand, blood, and fire. It was the last piece of a life no one ever asked her about. Her left leg, lost to an explosion in Kandahar, had been replaced with a matte black prosthetic that clicked softly with each step. To some, it was strange. To Charlotte, it was a heartbeat. Steady, relentless. The neighbors called her polite, the kids stared, the world kept moving, but she didn't ask for understanding. She had already earned it, in a place no one here would ever see. But one afternoon, on a sidewalk scorched by sun and cruelty, that silence would finally break. The sun was merciless that day. It shimmered over the pavement like a flame, warping the air above a half-finished construction site just 5 blocks from the VA clinic. Dust danced in the heat. Hammers struck steel in rhythm, and somewhere behind, a wall of scaffolding. Laughter rang out, harsh, careless. Charlotte walked the same sidewalk she always did. Her prosthetic clicked against the concrete with quiet defiance. Faded jeans, army green tee, skin browned from sun, eyes locked straight ahead. She wasn't looking for trouble, but trouble found her anyway. "Hey, sweetheart, wrong turn, the welfare office is that way." The voice came from behind a chain-link fence. Charlotte didn't flinch, didn't even blink. But the laughter that followed cracked the air like a whip. On the scaffolding, 3 workers leaned over, nudging each other. One exaggerated her limp, another faked a dramatic fall, and screamed mockingly. Below them, a burly foreman with a sweat-stained cap, Rick Talbot, chewed a toothpick like it owed him money. His voice carried like a bullhorn. "Somebody call the VA. Looks like one of their wind-up toys got loose." More laughter. Cruel. Immature. Loud enough to turn heads, including one, a teenage girl with a phone already pointed and recording. "Wait till TikTok sees RoboCop lady," she whispered, laughing. Charlotte didn't stop, but her jaw clenched, and in her hand, the marine cap crumpled slightly. She kept moving. She always did. But just across the street, parked beneath the shadow of a dusty sycamore, a black Chevy Suburban idled quietly, windows tinted, engine humming low. Inside sat Mason Carter, eyes locked on the scene. He didn't move, didn't blink, but the grip on his steering wheel tightened. He knew that walk, he remembered that limp, and he remembered the day Charlotte Evans saved his life, dragged him out of a burning Humvee in the middle of Kandahar while bullets tore the air like paper. She came back without her leg. He came back with a second chance. Now. Watching her humiliated by strangers who couldn't begin to understand, Something cold and steady unfurled in his chest. Not rage, something older. Honor. He picked up his phone. No more watching, he said flatly. Send the team. He hung up, and across town, 6 engines turned over in perfect unison. At the construction site, no one knew what was coming. But in less than 10 minutes, they'd remember a lesson too many had forgotten. You never mock the warrior who carried you home. It started with a sound. Not the usual clang of steel or the grind of concrete mixers, but something deeper. A low, synchronized rumble rolling down the block, like thunder disguised on wheels. Heads turned. From the far end of the street, 3 black SUVs came into view. Unmarked, unflinching. They moved in perfect formation, slow and steady, until they reached the front gate of the construction site. Then, as if choreographed, they stopped one after the other, completely blocking the entrance. Everything stopped. A hammer slipped from someone's hand and clattered to the ground. Even Rick Talbot squinted, suddenly less sure of his next punchline. Then, the doors opened. 7 men stepped out, uniformed not in camo, but in conviction tactical pants, tight black shirts, sunglasses, boots that looked built for war. They didn't shout, didn't swagger. They scanned the site like they had trained for it, reading angles, exits, body language, and at their center stood Mason Carter. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Charlotte Evans hadn't even turned around yet, but Mason's eyes never left her back. That limp, that cap in her hand, that calm. He stepped forward. Workers parted instinctively, like the air itself had thickened. Rick tried to laugh a nervous chuckle. Look, fellas, this some kind of drill. Mason didn't blink. Who humiliated Sergeant Charlotte Evans? Silence dropped like a bomb. Rick opened his mouth. We were just messing around. No big deal. She didn't even. It was a big deal, Mason interrupted. His tone didn't rise, but every word cut sharper than steel. Sergeant Evans served 3 tours overseas. In Kandahar, she saved my life and 2 others. She lost her leg doing it, and you think she's entertainment. One of the younger SEALs stepped forward and held up his phone. We recorded everything, he said flatly. Every word, every laugh, every insult, while you were on the clock, on public property. Rick paled. Workers glanced at each other, shifting uncomfortably. Some looked down. Others just froze, unsure whether to run, apologize, or disappear entirely. Mason stepped closer, so close Rick could see the trident tattoo beneath his rolled sleeve. She never asked for attention, never sought recognition, Mason said, voice firm, but we don't leave our own out there. Not in a war zone, and not in your concrete playground. He turned his back, a gesture louder than fists. Behind him, the 6 men fell into formation. No one cheered, no one clapped. They just watched, and in that silence, for the first time that day, Charlotte turned around, her eyes catching Mason's. And in that moment, Tucson witnessed something rare. A woman once mocked for her limp was saluted for her courage. Charlotte didn't know whether to stop or keep walking. But when she saw Mason standing in the middle of that construction site, not as a bystander, but as a wall between her and everything cruel behind her, she paused. She hadn't seen him in years. Not since that dusty hellhole in Kandahar where smoke had choked the sky and men screamed over radio static. Back then, Mason had been bleeding out behind a wrecked Humvee, and she had dragged him twice through sniper fire and shrapnel without hesitation. Now, here he was, not limping, not bleeding, standing tall in silence. Charlotte turned fully toward the site, her hand instinctively brushing the dog tags beneath her collar. She didn't speak, but Mason didn't need words. He stepped forward with deliberate grace, then snapped to attention. And then he saluted. Sharp, precise, flawless. Behind him, all 6 seals followed 7 salutes rising in unison, 7 heads held high. Not as a performance, not for the cameras, but because respect demanded it. Gasps echoed across the street. The workers who had mocked her earlier now stood speechless, some removing their hats, others lowering their heads in quiet shame. Even the girl who had filmed Charlotte earlier lowered her phone. The screen went dark. Charlotte's throat tightened. It had been years since someone looked at her with pride, not pity, not discomfort, but real, unwavering pride. And standing here now, in the middle of a city that had passed her by for too long, she felt something shift. She lifted her hand. Her salute wasn't perfect. Her prosthetic made it slightly off balance, but it was steady, unapologetic. Mason held the salute for one long breath, then stepped forward and reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small silver coin glinting softly in the sun, etched with a trident and an eagle. "This," he said, holding it between his palms, "is a Brotherhood coin, Navy issue. It's not given. It's earned." He placed it gently in her hand, closing her fingers around it. "You earned it years ago. You just never got it, because you were too busy saving lives." Charlotte's lip quivered, but she didn't cry. She couldn't. Not here, not now. Instead, she nodded once, a nod that carried the weight of every mission, every loss. Every day she walked through life unseen. But not today. Today, the world had paused, and someone had remembered. Someone had chosen not to walk past, not to forget, not to stay silent. And as Mason stepped back into formation, and the 7 turned to leave, Charlotte stood taller than she had in years. She wasn't just a veteran anymore. She was seen. The video went viral before Charlotte even made it home. Clips of Mason's calm voice. "She saved my life in Kandahar" were shared on every major platform within hours. News anchors played the footage on loop. Veteran groups reposted it with captions like, "This is how you honor a hero." And strangers flooded Charlotte's inbox with messages of support, gratitude, and apology. The next morning, a black SUV didn't show up at the job site, but a notice did. Rick Talbot, the foreman, had been removed from the project, indefinitely reassigned. The memo said, and right beside the construction entrance, workers were told to lay a single, custom-etched brick into the foundation. The message on it was simple: SGT Charlotte Evans, built on respect. But it wasn't the brick that changed everything. It was what came next. 3 days later, Charlotte received a call from Desert View High School, just a few blocks from the site. The principal's voice was kind, respectful. "We'd be honored," he said, "if you'd speak during Veterans Appreciation Week." Charlotte hesitated. She had never seen herself as a speaker. She didn't talk about the war. She barely talked about herself. But something about that invitation felt different. It wasn't about medals. It wasn't about pity. It was about truth. So she said yes. On a crisp Friday morning, she stood backstage in the school auditorium. A fresh blouse, pressed slacks, and for the first time in over a decade, her Marine cap on her head. Her prosthetic tapped quietly against the stage floor as she stepped to the podium. Hundreds of students sat in silence. Teachers leaned in. A few veterans in the crowd nodded gently, their eyes already glassy. Charlotte didn't bring slides. She didn't show photos. She just spoke. "Scars don't mean you're broken," she said. "They mean you survived something that tried to break you and you kept going." For a moment, the silence was total. Then someone stood. Then another. And another. The room erupted in applause. Some students cried. Some teachers clapped until their hands hurt. But Charlotte, she simply stood there, her heart full but calm. She hadn't wanted this attention. But maybe, just maybe she had needed this moment. Not to feel important, but to feel whole. And outside that auditorium, a young boy with a prosthetic arm waited with his mother. He wore a red hoodie and held something small in his hand, a printed screenshot of Charlotte's viral salute. When she stepped outside, he looked up at her with wide eyes and said, "I want to be strong like you." Charlotte knelt, smiled, and placed her brotherhood coin in his palm. "You already are," she whispered. Charlotte didn't set out to become a symbol. She wasn't chasing attention or applause. She had simply shown up day after day, walking that same path to the VA clinic, holding her head high and asking for nothing. But now, something was shifting. It began with the students. After her speech, Desert View High invited her back, not for a ceremony, for conversation. She met with small groups, veterans clubs, even kids who just wanted to understand what courage looked like up close. They asked questions she never expected. Not about war, but about fear, about loneliness, about walking into a room and not knowing if anyone saw you. She didn't give lectures. She just told the truth, and they listened. At the construction site, the engraved brick became more than a tribute. It became a turning point. Workers who once rolled their eyes at sensitivity training now stopped before clocking in, some placing a hand on the stone. The company began a new program called Respect in the Trades, not because they were pressured to, but because something about that moment had cut deep. One foreman admitted to staying silent too many times. Another broke down sharing how his brother, also a veteran, had been denied 4 jobs because of a prosthetic. By the 3rd training session, they weren't just nodding, they were talking and listening. Meanwhile, Charlotte kept her routine. Bus 27, Tuesday clinic visits, but people on that bus began to recognize her. Some nodded, some thanked her. One older woman, tears in her eyes, simply said, "We see you now." Charlotte would smile, quiet, grateful, still not craving the spotlight but no longer hiding from it. Then came the letters. From veterans across the country, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan, men and women who hadn't spoken of their service in years, some who hadn't left their homes in months. They wrote to her, saying things like, "I thought no one cared anymore. You reminded me why I kept going. Thank you for standing when I couldn't." She answered everyone, not with speeches, but with the same quiet strength that had carried her across fire, across grief, and now across a nation ready to listen. One afternoon, sitting outside a small cafe near the job site, Charlotte felt a familiar tap on her shoulder. It was Mason. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He handed her a photo. It was the challenge coin she had given the little boy, now displayed in a glass case at his elementary school, under a sign that read, "Be brave like Charlotte." Charlotte looked at the photo, then at Mason, and for the first time in years, she said something she'd held back for too long. "Thank you for reminding me who I was." Mason smiled. "You never forgot," he said quietly. The world just finally caught up. 6 months after that blistering day in Tucson, Charlotte Evans stood behind the curtain of a vast auditorium in Washington, D.C. It wasn't a battlefield. It wasn't a clinic. It was the National Veterans Conference. She had been invited not as a guest, not even as an honoree, but as the keynote speaker, a title that felt foreign to her. She wasn't a general. She didn't write memoirs. She didn't command stages. But somehow, here she was. The lights dimmed. A hush fell over the crowd. Hundreds of veterans, service members, and military families waited in silence. Charlotte stepped into the spotlight. She wore a simple dark dress, and her Marine cap, the same one she had tucked into her duffel bag all those years. Her prosthetic leg gleamed softly beneath the hemline. For once, she didn't feel the need to hide it. She didn't start with thanks. She didn't talk about medals. She talked about silence. For years, she began, I believed honor came from ranks, from salutes, from standing tall, but I've learned honor has nothing to do with how many limbs you have, or how straight you stand. The room was breathless. It's about how you face the storm, when everything tries to break you. Front row center sat Mason Carter, dressed in full uniform, arms folded respectfully. Beside him was the boy with the prosthetic arm, now wearing a tiny Marine Corps jacket stitched lovingly by his mother. His small hand clutched something shiny, the brotherhood coin Charlotte had once placed in his palm. Charlotte continued, Some of us come home whole. Some of us don't. Some scars you can see. Some you can't. But all of them matter. A single clap broke the silence. Then another. And then the entire auditorium rose to its feet. It wasn't applause for a speech. It was a salute for a truth finally spoken aloud. Charlotte stepped back from the podium, not to bask in it, but to share it. She had walked alone for years. Now, she walked with thousands behind her. Back in Tucson, the engraved brick at the construction site had become more than a symbol. Veterans made pilgrimages just to touch it. Teachers brought students. Workers told their sons and daughters about the day everything changed. Respect, it turned out, was contagious. It started with a cruel joke and became a movement. At the end of her speech, Charlotte left the stage to a standing ovation. Not because she'd impressed them, but because she reminded them that strength isn't loud. Sometimes, strength walks with a limp. Sometimes, it wears a faded cap and holds its head high in silence. But always it keeps walking. Honor isn't earned through applause. It isn't in medals, uniforms, or polished speeches. It's in the quiet decisions, the ones you make when no one's watching, like choosing dignity over anger, strength over silence, and standing tall even when the world tries to make you small. Charlotte Evans didn't want to be a hero, but when the world forgot her, she didn't yell. She walked, straight into the fire of ignorance and out the other side with her head held high. Her scars didn't define her. They revealed her, because sometimes the bravest people aren't the loudest. They're the ones still moving, when no one claps, still serving, when no one says thank you. So the next time you see someone limping forward, don't look away. Look closer. You might be looking at a warrior. Have you ever witnessed someone being mocked for something they couldn't control? Did you speak up, or did you wish you had? Tell me about the moment you almost stayed silent, but didn't. Or about the person who taught you what real courage looks like. Share your story in the comments, whether it's a veteran, a neighbor, or a loved one. Someone out there needs to hear it. And if Charlotte's journey moved you, don't let it end here. Like, subscribe, and pass this story on, because the quietest heroes deserve to be heard the loudest. Honor starts with remembrance, and remembrance starts with us.